Thank you all so much for coming. We're hoping at the end of our talk that you'll have some questions for us, but quite honestly, we're here also to solicit your advice. We have questions for you as we search for potential collaborators and make decisions about where we should go next with our application. We know why it has value to historians. Does it have any value for you? How could we create an application that would have value for you? Those are the major questions that we have, and we're definitely going to save time for those at the end. Before Claudio walks us through the application and we get into smallpox in the 1770s, I want to introduce very briefly the Center for Virtual History, which lives at ehistory.org. Now that we actually have work that we're proud of, we're going to have a designer redesign like this, so it won't look like this, which I designed feebly, in a week or so, but here is where it lives. It got started in 2010, quite frankly, despite the glowing introduction of these books, because Claudio and I were sick to death of writing and reading monographs, which is anathema in our discipline. That is the sine qua non of what we are supposed to be doing. But we wanted to find and explore new ways of collecting, displaying, and narrating historical data. Early on, we decided that we didn't want to deal with anything that we couldn't map, partly because we're just map geeks, but partly because maps are visual, and monographs don't do visual well. They certainly don't render space well, and spatial data can tell you a lot. So just to walk you through a couple of our other projects, we've just gotten this one uploaded and online. It's at indiannation.org. This is an online software that maps the 237,000 Native Americans who are documented in the census of 1900. That is the low point of the Native American population in the United States. So from 10 to 12 million on the continent when Columbus put his toe here, we are at less than 250,000 by 1900. And in that year, the government is essentially deciding all of these people should be assimilated, acculturated, their tribal councils should be dissolved, there should be no such thing anymore. We know now that after that low point, the population rebounds, and now we have 5 million Americans who claim Native American descent. The story of how that happened, that resistance, is partly spatial. It's about these enclaves of people and how they resisted acculturation. It's obvious, or more obvious, in places like these, in what became Oklahoma, but here is Indian Territory. But it's almost as interesting a story here in Georgia, where you have a little turpentine camp in Sinkhole, Georgia, where there are a dozen guys working in turpentine and resisting acculturation there too. So what this site does is it not only maps the 237,000 Native Americans, but has a page, a profile page for each one of these people and all of the communities that they lived in. And we give this to the world, and then users can go in and add data, biographical data about these profiles and about these communities. So it is at once a mapping application, but it's also a participatory archive. We have other projects that are coming online or will be coming online soon. I'm working on one that maps the coroner's reports from South Carolina from 1840 to 1880. These are things you can map, right? A coroner's inquest has to happen where the body lies. So you can start to ask questions about, well, did more slaves commit suicide in certain regions, working under certain conditions? You can answer questions like that. And we have another project that will map the WPA narratives. They went in the 1930s and interviewed ex-slaves. These are people in their 70s who were slaves when they were 7, remembering slavery. All of that information has been available online for a long time, but nobody has ever noticed that each of those carries an address. And no one has ever mapped them and said, okay, how far do they now live from their plantations? There are all kinds of interesting questions, I think, that can be answered when we start to map things. So today we're just going to look at one of our applications. Claudio is going to walk us through the smallpox epidemic that played such an important role in the conduct and outcome of the American Revolution. And here I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks. So I don't make a habit when I'm speaking to people of burying my head in the computer screen. In this case, I'm afraid I'm going to have to do that. I'm going to be navigating my way through this map, clicking on individual points. So most of the time, I will have my eyes on the screen. If you have a question at some point, feel free to just yell it out. I will do my best to answer. So let me at the outset thank Susan for this invitation, and Harry, who initially returned our emails coming from the history department. He probably was wondering what on earth we were writing to him about, but he very graciously responded, and we're very happy to be here today. So what you see here is a map of the smallpox epidemic, which sweeps through North America in the 1770s. And what we did, with the assistance of Elizabeth Fenn, who wrote just a tremendously fascinating book about this epidemic called Pox Americana. Is anyone familiar with that? Yeah, just a great book. And she, generously enough, she compiled a huge database of, I think it's about 3,700 references to the epidemic. She entered coordinates, geographic coordinates for each reference, and then she turned the data over to us. So, and that was 90% of the work, and then the other 10% was trying to create this app, which we've been working on for the last year. Is that really the case? And since we had this deadline to present it to you today, I think it was just rolled off the press a couple days ago. So I'm pretty clumsy with it still, but I'm going to try to describe this epidemic, narrate this epidemic to you, and really focus on 3 particular stories involving the epidemic. So here's the kind of continent-wide perspective. Again, each one of these points represents a historical reference. So there's something misleading, because I think naturally we look at this and we think this is a map of showing mortality, perhaps, or showing the complete extent of the epidemic, which is not at all the case. We have a lot of records here because there were a lot of literate people writing a lot of records. We can go back and find those. Here we have virtually no records, and you see almost no points, although we can be fairly certain that the epidemic moved through this part of the country too, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So here's the overview. You can see the key here on the right-hand side. Basically, the green points represent 1775, moving through yellow, orange, and then red, and the darkest red points represent the post-1782 occurrences. So let me, just to get us started, show you a video of a heat map showing the outbreak of the disease first in the northeast, and then moving down the Gulf Coast, eventually down into Mexico, and then up through the heart of the Great Plains, we believe, eventually culminating in present-day Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I can show you a different view of that same thing, so we can turn on this time slider and show you a year's worth of points at a time. So the earliest cases that we have recorded are in very late 1773, early 1774, around Boston, as you can see here. And then we can just walk through. You can see it exploding. So this is the siege of Boston, and then some Patriot troops move up the St. Lawrence and lay siege to Quebec, bringing the virus with them, and that's what you see there. And then it starts to move down the coast and down to the Gulf Coast around here. We have fewer records there. And then the first cases break out in Mexico City. We're not sure exactly how the virus got there, but there was enough trade that it's not surprising that it would end up there. And from there, it moves up Mexico. This area is fairly heavily populated, and then it moves through a string of Dominican and Franciscan missions. Moves up into Santa Fe, and then, as I said earlier, eventually culminates up here in Canada. So I'm going to, as I mentioned, just focus on 3 particular stories involving this epidemic. And the first one involves George Washington and the Continental Army. So I'm going to turn off the legend and the time slider. So here we see all of the cases recorded, and I will zoom into the Boston region. So here you can see these earliest points, 1774, 1775. They're in this very neat circle. 2 reasons for that. One is that we didn't want to stack all the points on top of each other. All these points actually have the same geographic coordinate. We didn't want to stack them all on top of each other. Visually, that would be very confusing. And the second reason we did that is simply that with these records from the 1770s, we frequently don't have a very clear idea of exactly the precise geographic location. So this also gives you a sense of the kind of uncertainty of exactly, precisely where we're talking about. So this app that we've developed has a search feature. It does not yet allow for Boolean searches, and it should, Steve and I hope, within the next couple weeks. So in other words, there's no and or not searching. But we can search through 3 fields, and I'm going to start off by searching the citation field for how. And we have 9 results. William Howe was the commander-in-chief of British Armed Forces in North America in 1775. So there are 9 records that mention him. And if we look at this one, the map zooms into this point, and I will just read you the quotation. So this is from Howe's Orderly book, November 30th, 1775. He is based in Boston now, besieged by the Continental Army, and he writes, "The smallpox spreading universally about the town makes it necessary for the safety of the troops that such men as are willing and have not had that distemper should be inoculated immediately." Now, this is not an especially serious threat for Howe and for his army, and the reason is simple. His troops come from Europe. The disease is endemic there, so the vast, vast majority of his soldiers have already been exposed, have caught the disease, and obviously have survived. There are a few of his soldiers who have not been exposed, and for them, he initiates this program, voluntary inoculation. If they wish to be inoculated, they can be. If they do choose this option, there is about a 2 to 3% chance of dying. Well, we wouldn't take those odds today, but it's a lot better than if you catch the disease naturally. By various estimates, you might have as high as a 40% chance of dying. But again, not a very serious threat to the redcoats. Now I'm going to search here, quotation for Shirley. This is not a woman, but Point Shirley, which is located in Boston. You can see there are returns 7 records. And I will zoom in here to Boston. We have a choice of 3 different base maps. So right now we're looking at the gray map, but we can also look at a topographic map. Obviously not, should load. Yeah. Not from the 18th century, because you see Logan Airport. In fact, there's been so much landfill that Boston Harbor looked almost nothing like this in the 18th century. Let's see if we can get this last tile to load. There we go. So this is, can you see my little arrow? Yeah. So this is historic Boston. Boston Commons is right about here. And right across this channel, you can see right here, Point Shirley. And what happens is that at the end of 1775, Howe orders about 300 of the poorest and most destitute Bostonians out of the city. He ships them off to Point Shirley with devastating consequences for surrounding colonists, as we'll see in just a minute. So again, there's 7 records that mention Point Shirley. Let's just see what they say. I can click on the first one. And this is from the diary of Ezekiel Price. Mrs. Sutton passed along about dusk from Cambridge homewards. She says that the people who came out last from Boston and landed at Point Shirley have the smallpox among them there. It was reported that Dr. Rand of Boston had said that he had effectually given the distemper among those people. In other words, this doctor in Boston had inoculated them. And the thing you need to understand about inoculation is that when you're inoculated, you only have a 2 to 3% chance of dying, but while the disease, the virus is working its way through your body, if you pass it along, you're fully contagious during that period, and if you pass it along to someone else, they have about a 40% chance of dying. So these people who have been inoculated and are still suffering from the virus are carriers, and they are introducing the virus. They're helping to spread the virus more generally through the colonies. I'll just click down here and read a couple more of these references. So I have it in command from His Excellency, this is George Washington, to inform you that notwithstanding his orders to the contrary, some of the persons that came last from Boston to Point Shirley have been at this camp. He is exceedingly desirous to prevent a measure that may prove of fatal consequence to the Army. Washington is deeply concerned about this possibility that the virus could be introduced into the Continental Army. Another record also about Point Shirley. Sir, the smallpox has broke out in 2 families that came out of Boston in the first vessels. 2 persons have it at Point Shirley and 1 at Malden. Another record also from the diary of Ezekiel Price. She says that the people who came out and landed at Point Shirley have the smallpox amongst them. And I'll read a couple more. Or let's just conclude with this last one. During the prevalency of this disease, every necessary precaution was taken by Dr. Morgan to confine it. Inquiry was made into the state of those who came from the town of Boston and were landed at Point Shirley, where numbers frequently came with it on them. So what is Washington to do? His situation is a lot different than Howe's. Howe's troops, again, come from Europe. The vast majority are immune to the virus. That's not the case of colonists, and it is not the case of the soldiers who make up the Continental Army. So if the virus is introduced, it could end the war virtually overnight, within a week or 2. Far more devastating than any single encounter he might end up having with the British Army. So let's look at Washington's response. I'll search citation for Washington. 254 records, and we're interested in his actions when he's based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So this is from his general orders. This is from July 4th, 1775, so even before these refugees have been sent out to Point Shirley. He says, no person is to be allowed to go to freshwater pond of fishing. This pond still exists. It's on the northwest edge of Cambridge, Massachusetts. So no person's allowed to go fishing there or on any other occasion, as there may be a danger of introducing the smallpox into the Army. July 19th, he's writing to the President of Congress. I have been particularly attentive to the least symptoms of smallpox. Hitherto, we have been so fortunate as to have every person removed so soon. We shall continue the utmost vigilance against this most dangerous enemy. And it's interesting use of the word enemy here, right? He's engaged in this war with Britain, but he sees this virus is an equally serious threat to the survival of his army. Now this is fascinating. So December 3rd, 1775, this is after Howe has sent the refugees to Point Shirley. Washington writes to John Hancock. A sailor says that a number of these coming out of Boston, have been inoculated with design of spreading the smallpox through this country and camp. I have communicated this to the General Court and recommended their attention thereto. And a few days later, he writes to John Hancock, the information I received that the enemy intended spreading the smallpox amongst us, I could not suppose them capable of. Every necessary precaution has been taken to prevent its being communicated to this army. So here is an early example of germ warfare. At least so it appears. We don't really know what Howe's intentions or motivations were, but it certainly seems possible, and Washington quite clearly recognizes the threat of the virus. So this siege runs from about May of 75 through April of 76, or March of 76, I believe. In the meantime, there's this disastrous siege at Quebec when the colonial troops move up there and lay siege to the city, and they're basically, through the winter of 75, 76, they are wiped out by the disease, so it's quite evident to Washington what the implications are for the larger body of continental troops. And once the siege is lifted in Boston, the action shifts down to New York City. And we can follow the troops there. So Washington digs in Lower Manhattan, what he calls New York City at the time. And let's just look to see what happens. So again, we're interested in the yellow points representing 1776. Colonel Hutchinson's, so this is Washington to one of his officers. Colonel Hutchinson's and the sergeant's regiments have arrived with one man who has the smallpox, but hope to be able to prevent the spreading of that fatal disorder. April 13th of 76, all persons infected with the smallpox are to be immediately removed to a secure place to be provided by the quartermaster general, who will consult with the magistrates of the city thereupon. A proper guard to be composed of men who have had that distemper or disorder for obvious reasons, to be fixed at the hospital to prevent any intercourse but such as the manager shall license. So it's an involuntary quarantine which Washington orders. The hospital, by the way, is established on Randall's Island, which is where the Triborough Bridge lands, and when it's crossing from, is that Queens over to Manhattan? I think that's right. And here are his orders establishing the guard at what they then called Montresor's Island, what we call Randall's Island today. Corporal, a sergeant, a corporal, 18 privates to be sent as soon as possible to Montresor's Island as guards for the smallpox hospital. He's not trying to protect the men who are recovering from smallpox. He's trying to keep them from escaping. Again, the last thing he wants is for this virus to be introduced into the army. And let's see, let's move out here, take a look at a couple more records. So here's one of Washington's generals, William Heath, who has made this risky decision to inoculate himself. Again, he has about a 2 to 3% chance of dying. Our general, having been inoculated with smallpox, went to Montresor's Island, where he went through the operation of that distemper. And I have good news to report. Our general, having recovered from the smallpox, which had been pretty severe, returned to the city and took the command of his brigade and was the next day general of the day. So Washington's troops once more escape the virus in New York City. They don't escape the British. They're pushed out of lower Manhattan. They move up the island to Harlem Heights, where once again they're pushed out. Then they cross the Hudson, and they spend the last 3 months of 1776 fleeing from the Redcoats. And on several occasions, Washington's army is within a few hours of being completely surrounded and destroyed by the British. But they do manage to escape, and most of us know the story. On Christmas night, they recross the Delaware River. They score this stunning victory at Trenton, and then a second victory at Princeton. And then his troops move north, and they set up winter camp in Morristown, New Jersey. The virus is obviously still a threat. It has not yet disappeared. And here's Washington expressing its sentiment, January 27th, 1777. He says, "I'm very much afraid that all the troops on their march from the southward will be infected with the smallpox, and that instead of having an army, we shall have a hospital." And so these fears, this is Morristown right here, these fears lead Washington to make this very risky decision. This is on February 4th of 1777. He writes to Hancock, and he says, "The smallpox has made such head in every quarter that I find it impossible to keep it from spreading through the whole army in the natural way. I have therefore determined not only to inoculate all the troops now here that have not had it, but shall order Dr. Shippen to inoculate the recruits as fast as they come into Philadelphia." So tremendously important decision, and I think you could easily make the case that the entire war hinges on this one decision. If he had not done this, the chances that the virus would have swept through the army were extraordinarily high. Now, I say this is a risky decision because the logistics of it are enormously difficult. He can't inoculate the entire army at once because there's no way you can sustain an army. He wouldn't have anybody to do all the daily tasks and chores that are necessary, even in winter camp, right, to keep people alive. He has to inoculate them in small groups. And while they're being inoculated, he has to keep them segregated from all the other troops. Otherwise, he himself would be responsible, right, for introducing the virus into the larger body of soldiers. So the logistics are enormously difficult. At the same time, he has to inoculate all of the recruits, and he has to make sure that they are inoculated before they arrive at the winter camp. So there are these extraordinary stories of young men being sent up from Virginia and Georgia and being inoculated along the way, and sometimes recovering and sometimes not. Sometimes they would be inoculated and then abandoned by the attendant doctor, so just left to recover or to die in these hostels that were along the roads. So I think one of the major turning points of the war. All right, let's move further south and look at a second story here. And this one involves an obscure little island in the Chesapeake. I'm going to search location for Gwynn, 15 matches. Gwynn is right down here. Let's see if we can zoom out. Here we go. And I'll give you a sense of what's there. Here it is, Gwynn Island. There's nothing. I mean, there's really nothing there today. But the scene of just this amazing story in 1776, which I'm going to tell you about, And this one involves, one of the central characters is Lord Dunmore, who was the royalist governor of Virginia. And a scoundrel in so many different ways. I specialize in Native American history, and there's a war in 1774, which we name after Dunmore, Lord Dunmore's War, in which he concocted a phony reason to invade Shawnee and Mingo territory and kill a number of Indians, entirely because he wanted to claim this western land for his colony of Virginia. So, as I say, a scoundrel in so many different ways. He is also famous in November of 1775 for something we call Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, which said in short that any slave who abandoned his or her plantation and fled to the British Army and joined the cause, took up arms on behalf of the king, would be granted freedom. Now, he didn't do this because he was an abolitionist. He had absolutely no interest in the freedom of enslaved peoples or in their welfare more generally, and that'll become clear in just a minute. He did it entirely out of military necessity in an attempt to re-seize control of the colony. So several hundred slaves get word of this proclamation and decide to take him up on his offer. We don't exactly know how many, probably around 1,000, maybe more. We simply don't know. And Dunmore forms what he calls the Ethiopian Regiment, composed of these fugitive slaves. Unfortunately, therefore, they are formed right in, I think, in the end of November of 1775. Smallpox almost immediately strikes the Ethiopian Regiment. And like other Americans, they hadn't been exposed to the disease. They are all susceptible to it, and they begin to die by the score. So Dunmore relocates the Ethiopian Regiment to this little island, Gwyn Island, and they continue to die. So let's take a look to see what happens there. So here's a record from May 31st of 1776. John James Pilot, taken on board Mr. Milfon's vessel, made his escape. So he was captured by the British and then escaped. He made his escape from the Roebuck by swimming 2 miles. He says Lord Dunmore loses 9 or 10 of his black regiment every day by the smallpox. Another record, this is from June of 76. We learn from Gloucester that Lord Dunmore has erected hospitals upon Gwyn's Island, that they are inoculating the blacks for the smallpox. His lordship had 2 of those wretches inoculated and sent ashore in order to spread the infection. Another example of germ warfare. But it was happily prevented. Well, they are dying by the day, and very soon after arriving at the islands, they decide to evacuate. So here's an account of that. The Negro troops, which had been inoculated before they left Norfolk, got through the disorder with great success, but the fever, there's a second illness which is striking them at the same time. The fever, which had been so fatal to them there, followed them to the island. And so Dunmore decides to evacuate, and let's see what happens. When the Patriots arrive, the scene that they find is horrifying. So July 8th, on our arrival, we found the enemy had evacuated the place with the greatest precipitation, and were struck with horror at the number of dead bodies in a state of putrefaction, strewed all the way from their battery to Cherry Point. By smallpox and other malignant disorders which have raged on board the fleet, for many months past. It is clear they have lost, since their arrival at Gwynn's Island, near 500 souls. And let me just read you one more account of this, if I can scroll down here. Let's see. A great number of dead bodies floated on shore of those who died of diseases, amongst them which were many blacks. The most intelligent of the deserters say that upwards of 1,000 Negroes have died within these 6 months. They have the smallpox and pestilential fever amongst them, which last rages with great violence, particularly amongst the Negroes. So, quite a different ending from the one I described with the Continental troops. These soldiers are also fighting for their freedom, obviously, and they are struck down with smallpox. Okay, let's move out west now and just explore very briefly what happens to Indians, native peoples west of the Mississippi River. So I mentioned the disease jumps down to Mexico City right at the end of 1779, and then makes its way up Mexico, heavily populated down here, series of Franciscan missions here, and also jumps across the Sea of Cortez to Baja California and makes its way up these missions as well. And here's one account of what happens. So this is December of 1780. This epidemic got started by the anchoring in the port of Laredo of a ship carrying infected families. The heathen Indians crowded into the caves when they noticed any infected with the disease, fled to another cave and abandoned those unfortunates. Some threw themselves into the sea. Others scorched themselves with firebrands. And the poor little children, abandoned beside the dead, died without help. So it moves up to New Mexico, as I mentioned, and then eventually makes its way all the way up to Saskatchewan and Manitoba. How does it get there? Our best guess is that it follows indigenous trade routes. And we know that there was extensive trade between the Southwest and these villages. This is the Missouri River you see here, and these are Mandan and Arikara villages, a trading center for this part of the country. And we have plenty of archaeological evidence, pre-Columbian as well as post-Columbian, of an extensive trade network that went straight through the Great Plains. So again, we don't have literate peoples living there in the 1770s. We don't really know what happened there, but it is highly likely that the virus was carried up by these indigenous traders and then by other traders up to central Saskatchewan. So why these two dense clusters of cases? Well, this is the territory that the Hudson's Bay Company operates in. This is a London-based fur trading company. They specialize in trading beaver pelts. The vast majority of their outposts are along the shores of Hudson Bay. But in 1774, they established this, their first inland trading post. This is Cumberland House. And then a few years after that, they established Hudson House here. So we have these people there recording on a day-to-day basis what's going on. And what they witness is really horrifying. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples of what they see. I'm going to search quotation for, I've played around with this, so wild beasts, and you'll see why in just a minute. Let's start with Cumberland House. January 14th, 1782. The news she brings, this is a Cree Indian woman, the news she brings is still more alarming of that cruel disorder, the smallpox, raging amongst them with its fury and carrying all before it. They chiefly die within the third or fourth night, and those that survive after that time are left to be devoured by the wild beasts. We'll move west to Hudson House. Take a look at this record. I'm very sorry that I should have such disagreeable news to send you, but the smallpox is raging all around us with great violence, sparing very few that takes it. The Indians lying dead about the barren ground. The barren ground is the British term for this part of North America. So the Indians lying dead about the barren ground like rotten sheep, their tents left standing, and the wild beasts devouring them. So let's just zoom back out to get a continent-wide perspective on this once more. So again, we've got these concentrations of records here, but what was going on here? How many thousands of native peoples were dying? We simply don't know. And how far north did this virus spread? Potentially it moved all the way through North America and all the way to the Aleutian Islands as well. We simply don't know. So let me stop here. And Steve mentioned at the outset that we are just kind of exploring the possibilities of this website. We'd like to develop it in all kinds of different ways. But one thing we want to do is try to bridge this divide between history and the humanities and the biological sciences. And that's why we look forward to this opportunity to speak to you today, to get some feedback about how and if this kind of website might be useful in your teaching to undergraduates, what would need to be changed to make it more useful, what you would like to see. So we're open to all kinds of suggestions or comments.